Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mike, from the Palm Springs Air Museum Pipe Band. We appreciate them. How many of you folks were here for the concert earlier today? How about a hand for that? That was fantastic. Thank you, Palm Springs Air Museum Pipe Band. Thank you, Mike. Well, hi, everybody. How are we doing today? Are we staying warm in Palm Springs? Our speaker today came in from Washington, D.C., so I don't think he's too sympathetic with us, but I don't know. I'm cold today. I almost wore pants this morning. I know you're thinking, put the pants on, great. But thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. The Air Museum appreciates your attendance, and this is a very special program for us. Of course, every year we like to honor our Canadian brothers to the north, and we will be doing so today. I see some poppies here that are being worn. And now our program today, I will say, we're stretching the boundaries of the Canadian to the British connection, to the American connection, but I know this presentation you're going to find to be fascinating, and I'm excited to have this. Of course, we'll be talking about the Battle of Britain and Billy Fiske, but before I get into too much of any of that, if I could ask everyone to please rise for the American and the Canadian national anthems. Can I ask all those that have served the United States, Canada, Great Britain in uniform to remain standing? The rest may be seated. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for our freedom. And not to get political, because the Air Museum is absolutely forbidden to get political. I started here about 13 years ago. And they said, you know, Greg, when you're talking on the microphone, there's no sex, there's no drugs, there's no rock and roll. Basically, that means don't get political. But I do think in today's times, with all that's going on in the world, it's important for us to remember who our friends are. God forbid anything more extreme is going to happen as the times go forward. But the United States absolutely knows who her friends are. Canada, Great Britain. So anyway, keep them in your prayers, folks. Well, I'm going to try to do two things at once here, and most people will say I can't even do one thing at once. But let me see. Look at that. All right. Well, there's our presentation today, but before I get there, I do want to acknowledge a few other people. Of course, our volunteers. Our volunteers are the heart and soul of the museum, the living history, if you will. Our volunteers are the people that guide the tours, that do the admissions, that really do all the heavy lifting, and at the end of the day get so little recognition. So I want to make sure that we thank them today. So please, how about a hand for our volunteers? I'm excited at the end of the month. It's been about 2 years since we've been able to have a volunteer appreciation party. And we're going to finally get to have one at the end of the month here in April. We get to give them a little dinner, a well-deserved dinner, and we have a bar, and the staff usually gets to hang out at the bar and shake the hands of all of our volunteers, and it's long overdue. So I do thank them so much. I want to also, of course, thank our members. These are the folks that help us do what it is that we do every day with their contributions. We had another group of school kids in here. They're slowly coming back. It's been too long since we've seen school buses here at the front, but they're coming back, and I'm getting calls every day saying, can I bring my kids in to see this air museum? And let me tell you, folks, although it may be stressful to think of, 40 fourth graders coming in, it's a good thing. It's a great thing because we're sharing the history that we had to share here. And once again, it's the volunteers that take them on tours and share the history. So if you're not a member, we'd love to have you give it some consideration. The volunteers over at the gift shop will be happy to get you signed up today. They'll count your admission dollars toward a membership. So please do think it over. We would absolutely love to have you. And speaking of people that we love to have, this is a new acquaintance for me, a gentleman that we haven't had the previous acquaintance with, but I did get to have dinner with last night. And he flew in all the way from the East Coast to be with us. And as I said before, I thank him so much. Mr. Ross Mirmelstein, let me tell you just a little bit about him. He is originally from Virginia. He graduated in 1971 from East Tennessee University with a BS degree in history. In 1975, he earned a master's in criminal justice from John Jay. He's had a wide career surrounding the area of law enforcement and working with sheriff's organizations to have their conventions all over the country, and he shared with me some great experiences. And I don't want to get ahead of him because I know he'll share a little bit of that with you, but I also want to share a little bit about why it is that he's here today. Because we're not talking about law enforcement so much today, but we are talking about his passion. As I mentioned, he does have a history degree, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about why it is he got so interested in the Battle of Britain. He's got a great collection of World War II art in his home that he shared with me about, and he came into the acquaintance of this organization, the Billy Fiske organization, who, by happenstance, the Air Museum also came into acquaintance with because the fact that we have a Spitfire. And through conversations, we were able to put something together. I felt that this program was very fitting for Canada Day. And you're going to see the little tangential Canadian piece here along the way, but the fight at the Battle of Britain is very obvious. So, won't you please welcome our featured speaker today, Mr. Ross Mirmelstein.
Thank you. To begin, right off the bat, I'm going to apologize for one thing. In September, I was operated on for stage 1 lung cancer. So I'm fine, they got it all, but they did a little slice and dice, and I have no bottom lobe on my right lung now. And I've been fighting a cough for the last couple of weeks. I'm fully vaxxed, including the booster. When this started, I went and had a COVID test and it came back negative. And I actually did a home test on Thursday to make sure that I was still negative. But as a result, sometimes I get a little short of breath. And if I cough once or twice, I will apologize in advance. But again, I'm not contagious. A little bit about myself. I am and have been for most of my life an unapologetic Anglophile. I grew up in Newport News and then Williamsburg, Virginia. And as a kid, my parents would not let me go to the 4th of July celebration in the restored area of Williamsburg without somebody being with me, because they figured that I'd probably be hung for being a Tory spy, or, you know. When I was in school, my first year in high school, 9th grade, and I'll date myself, 1962, I was a classic underachiever. If it was a class I liked, I did well. If it was a class I didn't like, I did enough to pass. My dad had been a Navy dentist during the war, and he was now in private practice. And one of his patients was the superintendent of schools in Newport News, and he sent me to see him. And I have always been a reader. And back in the 9th grade, in those years, I was really into Civil War history, or as those of us in the South call it, the War of Yankee Aggression. And so I go see this gentleman, and we start talking, and he asked me what was the last book that I had read. And I had just finished reading A Stillness at Appomattox that was written by Bruce Catton. And he looked at me and he goes, "That's graduate level reading. You're right." So we started talking, and he says, "I have a book I want you to read." Okay. It was a biography of Douglas Bader. Now, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with Douglas Bader. Bader was an RAF pilot who in 1931 had a flying accident, lost both legs below the knee. The RAF fitted him up with some tin legs and then medically discharged him. And he had a job, he was flying for Shell Oil. And with the war on the horizon, he decides he wants back in. And they figured, well, he'd never pass a flight physical, so basically to shut him up, they gave him a flight physical. Well, guess what? He passed it. And he was a legend. And one of the reasons that I'm bringing up this story about him was he was assigned during the Battle of Britain, and then afterwards, he commanded, I forget the squadron number, but it was a Canadian squadron. All Canadian pilots flying for the RAF. They were, what's the word I want to use? A rowdy bunch, not a whole lot of discipline, and he kind of whacked them into discipline. Bader went down on a rhubarb after the Battle of Britain in 41 over the French coast. And one of the prints that I have had, that I'll tell you about in a minute, was called Bader Bus Company. And it was a squadron that was led by later Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson, who went out there trying to find him. In the meantime, he had been captured. He was at a hospital in St. Omer, which was right next to the Luftwaffe airfield in northern France. And back then, the Luftwaffe contacted the RAF that Bader was a prisoner, but that one leg, well, both legs basically were crushed, and they didn't have artificial legs, so they would give the RAF permission, certain date, time, altitude, direction, to fly a plane over and drop him a new set of legs. Well, the RAF basically said, "You go to hell." And they sent over a squadron of Halifax bombers, bombed the airfield, and the last plane dropped the box called parachute with his legs. That evening, that afternoon, later on, at the hospital, they fitted him up with his tin legs, and of course, that night he tried to escape. He spent the rest of the war in POW camps. And there's a reason I'm bringing up some of this that I'll get into in a little bit. He was at, if you're familiar with The Great Escape, he was at Stalag Luft 3-7. When The Great Escape happened, that's when the 77, I think, escaped from that prison. All but 2 were captured. The 2 eventually made it back to England, but the Nazis executed 50. I get a little emotional about some of this. Anyway, going back to the 9th grade, it got me into the Battle of Britain. And I have since read literally every book I've ever seen or known about on the Battle of Britain. And I mean, I'm also a World War II historian, but Battle of Britain has been my thing. Like I said, I'm a confirmed Anglophile. I've been for most of my life. I've had fun in the last 2 years. This is the mask I've been using. I wear the RAF tie. That's why I wore it today. And the reason I wore this jacket in particular, growing up next to my folks when they had moved to Williamsburg, was an English couple. And the wife had lost a brother flying during the Battle of Britain, and down the road she gave me these cufflinks, these buttons. This is now, I think, the 5th or 6th blazer I've had them on, and they're the RAF insignia. I knew who Billy Fiske was. Didn't really know a whole lot about him. I mean, with all my reading, you read about so many of the pilots. What was interesting was that first time I went over to London a number of years ago, and I went to St. Paul's Cathedral. And in the crypt in St. Paul's, there is a plaque. It's the only plaque, I believe, that's dedicated to an American. And it was unveiled on the 4th of July in 1941. And the inscription is, he gave his life so that Britain would live. So I didn't know anything about the Billy Fiske Foundation. And last summer, for some strange reason, I downloaded Instagram onto my phone. And I don't post anything on social media, but you can like certain things when you see posts, and anything that had to do with aviation history or aviation art, I liked. And there was a posting that I saw about the Billy Fiske Foundation. And I sent them a donation. And then they kept putting a post that on August 17th would be the 6th annual Billy Fiske dinner. And they're raising money. And I'm going to, in a second, talk about the foundation. Greg mentioned the fact that I have been collecting aviation art since 1975. I bought my first piece. And the woman I deal with, who now has her gallery, and unfortunately she's in pretty rough shape with Parkinson's, is actually turned out to be a cousin of Douglas Bader. Her name is Virginia Bader. And her gallery, and she's been involved with the military gallery in England. Her gallery is out by John Wayne Airport in Anaheim. As a matter of fact, the building she's in overlooks one of the runways. And I was in graduate school in New York, and I was working for one of the deans. I was a graduate assistant, and I got the flu, and I was sent home. And walking home up the street that I lived on, I decided I got to find something to read. And I stopped in a sundry shop, and wow, here was the biography of Douglas Bader that I had read in the 9th grade. Ballantine Books at the time in the 70s was republishing a lot of the World War II books. So I said, I'll buy it, read it again. And on the cover was a picture of a painting that was done by an English artist, Frank Wooten, called Botter Bailout. And when you opened up on the inside of the front cover, it said, if you'd like to own a copy of this, a lithograph of it, signed by both the artist and Douglas Botter, here's who you contact. Well, that was the first piece I bought. It was $75. I don't want to tell you how much I've been offered for it now. It turns out there were only 50 of them available in the United States at that time. I have one of them. And that started it. And Virginia Botter and I, over the years, became very good friends through her. When I was living in Chicago, I got a call from her. And this is great. She goes, what are you doing Friday night? She's in Virginia at this time. Her gallery was in Alexandria. And I said, well, Virginia, what do you want me to do? She says, do you know where the Ambassador East Hotel is, the pump room? Oh, yes, a block and a half from where I live. She says, well, meet me there at 7 o'clock for dinner. I've got a surprise for you. And she was on her way to the fly-in in Oshkosh, the EAA annual fly-in that I've been to a couple of times. And she had with her cousin Douglas Botter and General Adolf Galland, who was the youngest Luftwaffe general during the war. So I had dinner with her. Unbelievable. And then ended up after dinner in the bar with them, smoking cigars and listening to them talk till we closed the bar at 4 in the morning. And this was, I think, a year, maybe two before Douglas Botter passed away. Botter had been knighted. What was interesting, though, is that he wasn't knighted by the Queen because of what he had done during the war. After the war, he became very involved with disabled vets and spent a lot of time with them. That's what he was knighted for. What was interesting was that after the war, a lot of the Allied pilots who flew against the Germans, as well as German pilots, became friends. So Galland and Botter were together with her that night. I had dinner with him. Then fast forward to like 1991, I've now moved to Northern Virginia. I'm with the National Sheriff's Association. And she, of course, by this time had moved to California. And she calls me again and she says, what are you doing Thursday night? Okay, what do you want me to do? She says, well, I'm coming in and I'm bringing somebody in who's going to be speaking at Udvar Hazy that night. And for those of you that don't know, the National Air and Space Museum that the Smithsonian runs, they now have a second museum that's out by Dulles Airport called Udvar Hazy, and it is huge. And they do lectures out there. And this was back when Don Lopez, who flew, he wasn't with the AVG, the Flying Tigers, but he flew in China afterwards, was an ace and became a test pilot. And at this time, he was with the National Air and Space Museum. So I meet her at a restaurant out near Tice's Corner, and who does she have with her? Who was speaking that night? General Gunther Roll. Now, for those of you who don't know who Gunther Roll was, Luftwaffe pilot, third highest scoring ace of all time, 295 kills. Flew during the Battle of Britain. Most of his kills he flew on the Eastern Front against the Russians, and then later in the war back again against the Americans and the Brits, the RAF. And I had dinner with him. And just, what a gentleman. After the war, when he was finally released from prison in England, and he goes back to Germany. He was one of the people who helped found the West German Air Force, and he ended up Inspector General of NATO Air. And he was something else. And I mean, so that's the kind of thing that I've been involved in. Like I said, I collected my first piece of art. I now have over 50 pieces, and some of them are very, very limited editions. Matter of fact, I just ordered, for some strange reason, a new piece that there would be several levels on these lithographs, and of course, the more signatures that are on them, or if the artist has done what they call a remark, which is like a pencil drawing that's in the border of one of these prints. The more of that you have, the more expensive they get, and the less that they make available. I figure if you're going to do something, do it right. There are only going to be 25 of these in the world. Well, one will be hanging in my house. I've got another print that I was looking at the other day that was a Robert Taylor, the artist, Battle of Britain print. And I had forgotten, I looked at it. It's number 5 of 15. So I've got some pretty interesting stuff. So anyway, when I saw this stuff online about the Billy Fiske Foundation and this dinner that they were having, and like I said, I sent them a donation. I got a letter back from them. And I want to read this letter because this will talk about what the foundation is about. And again, this is something that, and I'll talk when I'm done with this, on something that I'm doing with them now. I'm volunteering with the foundation. So on behalf of the Billy Fiske Foundation, I'd like to thank you for your contribution. As you are aware, the Billy Fiske Foundation has recently been established to permanently recognize and commemorate the contributions and heritage of William Meade Lindsley Fiske III, which is quite a mouthful. We believe that Billy Fiske represents everything good about the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. As part of the effort to maintain Fiske's legacy, the Foundation is working in collaboration with the Royal Air Force, the United States Embassy in London, it's a new embassy, and the Wandsworth Council to erect a statue near the embassy as a present reminder of those coming and going about the embassy of the spirit and friendship that led Fiske to join with his friends to fight and ultimately die to preserve the freedom and liberty that both our nations hold as fundamental. More than just putting up a statue, the Foundation's ongoing purpose is about building and strengthening the individual friendships that are fabric of the relationship that allows the Churchills and Roosevelts and the Thatchers and Reagans to find common ground. We hope to bring school groups from both nations together to form new friendships, as well as celebrate those long-standing friendships that may have grown dim with age. The Billy Fiske Foundation is a nonprofit charity established under Section 501c3 of Title 26 of the U.S. Code. We are committed to the highest standards of ethics and accountability in nonprofit governance, management, and operations. Moreover, our books are fully open and transport to all donors. Again, thank you for your generosity. So I'm seeing they're talking about the dinner that they're going to have in August, and I finally was able to contact them. Their offices are in Washington, and the gentleman who is the president of the association, of the foundation, is actually a former Undersecretary of the Air Force under Bush 1. And in some of their postings, they said they were looking at people wanting to donate. items that they're doing a silent auction at this dinner. So I called them and I said, well, one, I do want to go to the dinner. I said, but secondly, how'd you like to have 2 pieces of aviation art? And I gave them 2 pieces I donated that were sold that night for a nice chunk of change, the 2 pieces. One of them was called Hellfire Corner. And Hellfire Corner was southeast in England. And it was an area between Dover, Folkestone, and I forget the third area. And more people went down, more people died there. It was the shortest distance between France and England. And that's where most of the heavy fighting, not all, but quite a bit of it. Now, Billy Fiske was in, I'll get to this in a minute, was in 601 Squadron, which was County of London Squadron, Royal Auxiliary Air Force, otherwise known as the Millionaire Squadron. And I'll get into that in a second. So that was the first piece that I gave them, called Hellfire Corner, that was signed by, I think it was 10 pilots, some of them RAF, a couple of Royal Canadian Air Force who were now flying with the RAF, a couple of them, well, one American, and actually Adolf Galland. The second piece I gave them was called Botter's Bus Company. Like I said, this is after the Battle of Britain, when Douglas Bader basically got into it with, according to the story, 50 ME-109s. Some of the question is whether he was shot down or the painting that was done, the piece that I had, and the way it was first reported was that the ME-109 sheared off the tail of his Spitfire. And Bader Bus Company, it was, like I said, Johnny Johnston, who ended up as Air Vice Marshal, had taken over when Bader went down his squadron, and it was, again, all Canadians. And they flew out over France. They were trying to find Bader. So those were the 2 pieces I've given them. Now, I am, at the moment, semi-retired. I've been trying to decide when I do retire, because I'm not sure where I'm going yet. I'm leaving Northern Virginia. It's too damn expensive. What am I going to do with all this art? I have contacted the National Air and Space Museum and met with them, and they're like, they'd love to have it. And it would be on display for a while, but then they get so much stuff it would end up going into storage. No, I don't think so. If I give it, I want people who are going to appreciate it and display it. I am a charter member of the World War II Museum in New Orleans, and I met with them. And they told me that they only accept actual artifacts from the war. And I said, well, these aren't artifacts, but these are all signed by pilots. And they all have certificates of authenticity. Like I said, most of what I have is Battle of Britain. I also have one piece that was AVG called Rated Chiang Mai. In 2000, I was invited by, I have a very good friend who unfortunately passed away this past year at 101, was one of the founders of the Air Force Association, and his wife, her dad, Rich Richardson, was a radio man with the AVG, Flying Tigers, and I helped put on their final, as it turned out, reunion. At this time, there were 25 of them left alive. And I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with General Tex Hill. Tex Hill was an AVG pilot. He retired as a brigadier. At this time, he was 92, I think. And he was there with his wife. And the first night we had a banquet, and then went upstairs to a hospitality room, and I'm talking to Tex, and he looks at me and he says, "I understand you drive a Corvette." I said, "Yes, sir. I've been driving Corvettes for almost 30 years. And the next morning, we were taking these folks to Arlington for a wreath-laying ceremony at General Chenault's grave. And Tex looks at me and he goes, and I'm quoting, "I don't want to ride in a damn bus." He says, "We're going to go in your Corvette." I said, "Absolutely, sir." He says, "You going to put the top down?" And I had a convertible at that time. I said, "Yes, sir." And this was Memorial Day weekend. It was like 85. It was beautiful. He says, "That's great." He says, "You going to let me drive?" I said, "Not on your life." Tex, you're 92 years old. I said, "You can't see your hand in front of your face." He says, "God damn it, I'm a fighter pilot." And he looks over, his wife that was there with him, Maisie, and he looks and he grins. He said, "Yeah, and Maisie killed me if you gave her the keys." So, I mean, I have, over the years, it's because of, it started, like I said, it started when I was very young. I've been fascinated with the Battle of Britain, and now I am involved with the foundation. And basically, up till now, any money they have raised has come from silent auction or people who join the foundation and give them a donation. So I have been meeting with Kevin Billings. We've met for lunch several times. And one of the things that I have done over the years as being the director of meetings at the Sheriff's Association is I've also been involved with marketing the meetings. So I'm putting together a plan that the first thing that we're going to do, and I have a very, very good friend who actually spoke at my conference a few years ago, who was flight leader of the Thunderbirds in 2000, 2001. It turns out lives around the corner from me. And what I want to do is he's going to start, we're actually meeting for lunch this next week, to get the Thunderbird Foundation to support, to back what we're doing. And from there, we're going to go to the Blue Angels. Kevin has the contacts in England. We're going to go to the Red Arrows. Well, I've got a contact. We're also going to go, hopefully, to the Snowbirds, which is the Canadian flight demo team. And what's been fun is, again, that over the years, I've seen all of these teams. And I have a good time ragging my buddy that Thunderbirds are great, but they're number 3. And number 1's the Blue Angels. I was Navy. I mean, yeah, come on. I said number 2 are the Red Arrows, the Royal Air Force. So Thunderbirds are great, but they're number 3. So we argue about that all the time. And then what we do after we get the endorsement of those 4, and we'll go after some others as well, then we're going to start hitting the Boeings and the Grummans and the other companies and get them to start giving us some money. So we'll see how that works. This is a foundation now that I'm semi-retired, I can throw a lot of energy into. And it's become a passion of mine. Now, let me tell you about Billy Fiske. And when we're done, by the way, I will be more than happy to open this up to questions. And again, my name is Ross. I don't stand on the ceremony. There are several books that I will talk about and I'll give you the names of at the end of this. In one of the books, it's called Gentlemen of London, and there's a chapter in it about Billy Fiske, but it also talks about in the book Ed Murrow and Eric Sevareid and a lot of the the folks that were in England reported during the Battle of Britain. And I'm going to quote here. At the time when the U.S. government was still reluctant to put its servicemen in harm's way, a memorial service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral in London to honor one young American who had already lost his life in the fight against Germany. In the crypt of the bomb-scarred cathedral, several hundred people, among them Gil Winant, who was the new ambassador to England. The previous ambassador was Joseph Kennedy, who was convinced that England was going to lose the war and the Germans were going to be taking over England. I mean, he was unbelievable. He was replaced. I've never been a fan of Joseph Kennedy. Gathered on July 4th, 1941 for the unveiling of a plaque in memory of William Fiske III, who, in the words engraved on the plaque, died that England might live. If any of you have not been, or if you go to England, I would urge you, and there's going to be several places I'm going to talk about, go to St. Paul's Cathedral. There is a fee, it's not much, but go down to the crypts. Billy Fiske, I believe, is the only American who's got a plaque dedicated to him down there. Wellington's tomb is there. Nelson's tomb is down there. It's a pretty interesting place. Again, I quote, "The first U.S. citizen to join the Royal Air Force, and the first American pilot killed in action during the war in Europe. Billy Fiske had been born in New York, but spent his adolescence and young adulthood in Europe. Addicted to speed and adventure, Fiske, the son of a wealthy stockbroker, drove a supercharged Bentley, and in his teens and early 20s had twice won Olympic gold medals in the daredevil sport of bobsledding. He was, said one friend, very much the golden boy. Good looks, wealth, charm, intelligence. He had it all. A Cambridge graduate, he told his British friends in the 1930s that if war came, I want to be in it with you from the start. Now, what was interesting was that the U.S., back in 1939, had passed the Neutrality Acts, which made it a crime. It said, in its desperate attempt to keep the United States out of war, the American government had enacted a series of regulations that, among other things, made it illegal to join a warring powers military service, travel on a belligerent ship, or use a U.S. passport to go to a foreign country to enlist. Those who were caught were subject to a $10,000 fine, several years of imprisonment, and loss of their American citizenship. Bypassing the regulations by falsely claiming Canadian citizenship, Fiske joined the RAF less than 3 weeks after Britain's declaration of war against Germany. He was posted to 601 Squadron, which was known as the Millionaire Squadron, because of all the fluent young men, several of whom were pre-war friends of Fiske from Cambridge. This is great. The squadron's pilots lined their uniform jackets with red silk, their overcoats with mink, and won and lost hundreds of pounds in poker games while waiting to fly and fight. Fiske's wife, Rose, and I'll talk about her in a minute, commented they were arrogant and looked terrific, and probably the other squadrons hated their guts, she said. But they were also expert pilots. And even though Fiske only had, at this time, 90 hours of solo flying to his credit when he joined the RAF, he soon matched them in skill. Sir Archibald Hope, 601's commanding officer, said it was unbelievable how good he was. He later noted he picked up fast. He was a natural as a fighter pilot. Fiske was credited with 3 kills and several probables. On August 16, 1940, during one of the Luftwaffe's heaviest attacks on RAF airfields. Now, what was interesting is the Germans did a couple of things really stupid at the beginning of the war against the British. Thank God. Okay? Goering was a fat, drug-addicted egomaniac who had been an ace in the First World War. When the Battle of Britain first began, he sent Stukas to dive bomb the radar towers, the chain net along the coast of England. He thought, A, that the first time that he raided them, he knocked them all out of action. Basically, the ones that were hit were back up online within a day or two. And the second thing he did was, well, he thought that, radar, he didn't think much of it, didn't see how it would help, which it did. So he switched, and he had the Luftwaffe and then start bombing the airfields. Fiske was Station 601 Squadron was at Panmure, near Dover, on the southern coast, southeastern coast of England. 11 Group, which they were part of, was commanded by Keith Park. And at the time, the Air Vice Marshal for the RAF, basically for the fighters, was a gentleman named of Dowding, who, quite frankly, Churchill screwed after the Battle of Britain. What had happened was near the end of the Battle of France, the RAF had sent, I think it was 11 squadrons during the Battle of France of Hurricanes to France. Quite a number of them didn't make it back. And then just before France fell, Churchill had flown over Paris, and his escort was actually the pilots from 601 Squadron. And he promised the French that he would send 5 squadrons of Spitfires. When he got back, he sent orders to Dowding to send the 5 squadrons of Spitfires, and Dowding refused. And he did not do it. And Dowding was a realist, and he said, we're going to need them for the defense of England. Now, one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that at the time, and I will immediately say the RAF, not only do I think the world of it, but the Spitfire is absolutely my favorite plane of all time. I think it's the most beautiful plane that was ever built. Over here is a later model of a Spit with a Griffon engine. The Spits during the earlier part of the war, they had Merlin engines. An interesting story, P-51 later in the war became the fighter plane. And part of it was because drop tanks let it escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But the second thing was, when the Brits first looked at it, they didn't want it. It was underpowered with an American Allison engine. So they ended up putting a Merlin engine in a Spitfire. And it became, unbelievable. They put it in a P-51. And that really made the P-51 the plane it was. The P-51 is a beautiful, great airplane. It was fast. It was a hell of a plane. And like I said, they were able, once they put the British Merlin engine in it, and then later in the war, they were using these called a Griffon engine. But I digress. So Dowding refused Churchill's order to send 5 squadrons of Spitfires to France because he said, one, they're not going to do any good. The French are going to lose. And secondly, we need them for the defense of Italy. A lot of people also realize that the Spitfire has gotten most of the acclaim. They were actually, during the Battle of Britain days, there were more Hurricanes, more squadrons of Hurricanes than Spits. And the one thing about a Spitfire was it was the only Allied plane that actually flew and fought from the beginning of the war to the end. The only one. B-51s didn't come in until later in the war. The Hurricanes were no longer used. The Brits developed some other planes, the Tempest, the Typhoon. But anyway, the Hurricane, and that's what 601 Squadron flew, were Hurricanes. Said on August 16th, 1940, during one of the Luftwaffe's heaviest attacks on RAF airfields in the Battle of Britain, Fiske Hurricane was hit. They were going after Stukas, and one of the other stories is that probably was a lucky round from a rear gunner in a Stuka that hit his engine. One of the problems with British planes was right in front of the pilot, below him, was an 85-gallon tank of high-octane gas. This Hurricane was hit. Despite severe burns, he managed to nurse his badly damaged plane back to his base at Tangmere. 2 days later, he died of his injuries. Actually, it was the next day. Britain's Air Minister at St. Paul's said he had no obligations to fight for this country. He was not an Englishman. He gave his life for his friends and for the common cause of free men everywhere, the cause of liberty. Sitting in the audience that day, dressed in RAF blue, were several of the other Americans who took part in the Battle of Britain. Now, officially, it says that in all, 7 U.S. citizens flew in the battle, joining more than 500 other non-British pilots, including Poles, Czechs, Belgians, French, New Zealanders, South Africans, Canadians. Of the members of this polyglot Air Force, only the Americans were breaking the laws of their country by flying. So Billy Fiske was the first American to fly for the RAF, and then unfortunately he was the first to die. Let me tell you about Billy Fiske. At 16 years of age, he won Olympic gold as the driver of the, I think back then it was a 5-man bobsled team. 4 years later, at the Winter Games in 1932, which were at Lake Placid, he carried the American flag in at the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. He captained the American bobsled team, which won gold again. He was asked to join the 36th team, and he refused. He hated Hitler. I will not go to Germany. The games that year were held in Bavaria. He wouldn't go. Like I said, he came from money. He came from a lot of money. Was born in New York. His dad was a investment banker, stockbroker, owned his own firm. Fiske went to school, not only for some reason in Chicago, but then in France, in Paris, and London. He went to Cambridge, where he graduated from. And like I said, at this time, by the time he graduated from Cambridge, he was not a pilot, but he wanted to fly. He wanted to join the Royal Air Force, and he was turned down. Because at this point, war had begun, and the Brits weren't looking for Americans to fly for them. Now, the interesting thing is that, again, according to official records, there were 7 Americans who flew the Brits. during the Battle of Britain. Well, there were actually quite a few more. Because what happened was, and then after the Battle of Britain, the Eagle squadrons were formed. There were 3 squadrons, they were all American pilots. But a lot of the Americans who went through Canada with fake passports, and then from there to England, were listed as Canadian, in addition to the actual Canadians who flew. So at the time of the ceremony honoring Fiske, thousands of Americans had disregarded their country's prohibitions and enlisted on Britain's side. Now, the interesting thing is that when he was turned down to join the RAF, he went back to America. He started dabbling, he went to Hollywood. He co-produced a movie and took flying lessons, became a pilot. But what he also did was, after the 32 Olympics, he went and participated in the Cresta Run. The Cresta Run is over in Europe, in Switzerland, and it was basically like one-man, the skeleton sleds that you see today, and he set records. While there, he met Roger Bushell, who was RAF, of course, and for a time, after Billy joined 601 Squadron, Bushell was with 601, and if the name rings a bell, Bushell was shot down, captured, was known as Big X. If you've ever seen the movie of The Great Escape, which most of it is a bit of fiction, there were no Americans in that camp at the time. There was no Steve McQueen riding a motorcycle. It was all Hollywood. But Bushell was real. And he had escaped from several camps, almost made it. And once he got caught right at the German-Swiss border. And after the 3rd or 4th attempt, he was flat out told that if you try and escape again and you are captured, you will die. Well, he was one of the 50 who was killed. But while Billy was in St. Moritz doing the Cresta Run, that's when he met the woman that he married. And there was a bit of a scandal there too. His wife Rose had been married to the Earl of Warwick. She was Lady Warwick. And some of the descriptions of her is that she was a beautiful woman. She divorced her husband, was engaged in a pretty nasty custody battle over their son that she lost. And then she went to Hollywood to try and break into movies. And that's when she and Billy got married. So in early 40, I mean, it was late 39, early 40, one of Billy's friends who he'd known from Oxford, and there were 3 Americans, they sailed on the Aquitania to Britain. Now at this time, Billy has got his wings, he's a pilot. He volunteers and is accepted into the Royal Air Force. He goes through their flight training. And when he graduates, he puts in a request that he wants to go to 601 Squadron. And instead, he is summoned to the office of the Air Minister, who has come up with the idea, we'd like to send you back to America on propaganda to get Americans to join the RAF. And Fiske starts thinking, he goes, I can't do this. Number one, if I say no, they're not going to let me join 601 Squadron. Number two, if I do go back, I'm probably going to be arrested for violation of neutrality laws. So he comes with the idea, he says, you know, sir, he said, it would be better if once I have shot down a few planes, you send me over. And they thought, well, that makes sense. It's a good idea. So he is posted to 601 Squadron. Now, a lot of the people in 601 Squadron he knew from Cambridge. Like I said, 601 Squadron was in that southeastern part of England that was part of 11 Group. And what's really interesting, here again, if you have not been over, or if you do go over, if you have not been, go to the Battle of Britain bunker in Uxbridge. I've been there twice, and they've since done a lot of work on it, and there's now a visitor center. But that was the command post. That was where things happened for 11 Group. And it's 60 feet on the ground. And if any of you have seen the movie, The Battle of Britain, you see the large wooden table, I'll call it, with the map of like the French coast, England. On the wall are the system that the RAF had developed for each squadron, would let them know if they were on the ground, if they were refueling, if they were in the air, and it was done by lights. And you had WAFs around the table, and as they got reports of German planes coming across the channel, they were moving them. So the folks, the controllers who were overlooking this room could then contact the pilots, the different stations, the airfields, and give them where the German planes were, because of radar, the number, the altitude, where they were heading. Like I said, Gary had turned his attention to the airfields, and a lot of the airfields were heavily bombed. But one of the good things was that German intelligence was really pretty poor. And they kept telling Gary and the German Air Force that Brits were down to their final 300 planes, which they were not. They misread. The Brits had set up camouflage fake air bases near actual air stations, and the Germans would hit the fake stations. It was pretty interesting what went on. But the Battle of Britain, officially, they said that the date that it started was, I believe it was like July 10th. When that started, the Luftwaffe was going after convoys in the channel. And Dowding really didn't rise to the bait. He refused to send heavy numbers of RAF. So most of the battle, quite frankly, was fought over England. And what made it interesting was, number one, the German escorts, fighters, the Me-109s, the 110s, which Gary thought was going to be a miracle weapon. It was a twin-engine fighter, was nowhere near as good as the Lightning turned out to be. And the 109s ended up having to defend the Me-110s. So you had fighters defending fighters. Now, the other interesting thing was that during the battle, there were less, again, like I said, there were less Spitfire squadrons than Hurricane squadrons. And what happened as a rule was that the Spitfires were directed to go after the fighter escorts, and the Hurricanes went after the bombers. And like I said, Billy Fiske went down going after Stuka and the dive bombers. There were a little bit over 500 RAF who were killed flying during the Battle of Britain. August 15th, is known as Eagle Day. And that was the first day when the Germans really sent over amazing amounts. I mean, they did outnumber the RAF as far as number of planes. That was the real beginning of the air war over England. Like I said, for a while, Goering was directing the bombers to go after the air bases. Well, one of the things that happened was at night, a German bomber basically got lost and decided to jettison his bombs, and he ended up bombing a suburb of London. Well, Churchill got bent out of shape over that. The next night, he sent a flight of Halifax bombers and bombed Berlin, which, as it turned out, even though that was the beginning of the Blitz, was the best thing that happened, because the Germans no longer concentrated on the airfields. And the pilots, and actually on both sides at this time, were the number of sorties that the Brits were flying every day. These folks were exhausted. The Germans, quite frankly, were better trained. Of course, they had been flying since Spain. The Brits, because of losses, were their training time was much shorter. They were sending people into the squadrons with some of them near the end of the Battle of Britain with no more than 20 hours of solo time. The average length of time during the Battle of Britain that a pilot was expected to live was literally no more than a week, 2 weeks. But, like I said, Billy Fiske was a natural, as it turned out. September 15th is Battle of Britain Day in England. And there is an air show every year at Duxford, which is now a museum. Duxford was in 12 matter of fact, Potter flew out of Duxford. But most of the action took place over Leavenworth, southeast of England, which included London. If you have a chance to go over to that air show, one of the things at the end of the air show, there are in England, if I remember correctly, the number is 22 Spitfires that are still flying, and they do a flyover. And they turn and come back, and when they come back for the second pass, they are followed by the Red Arrows, who then put on a show. Duxford is now also a museum. The American Air Museum in Britain is at Duxford. Again, it's if you go over, if you have a chance to go over in September and go to that air show. The museum, they now have set up an area that is strictly a Battle of Britain memorial. With, again, they have some restored Spitfires, Hurricane, I believe an MB-109, which was the main German fighter during that period of the war. The Focke-Wulf 190 did not come along till later. Near Duxford on the way up, is the only American cemetery in World War II that's in England. The American Cemetery at Mattingly, near Cambridge. And I was honored, lucky enough to help take the flag down. And there is a marble wall right near the chapel at the cemetery. It has the names of aircrew, pilots, people on planes who disappeared, their bodies were never found. I found on that wall one of my dad's best friends growing up. was actually a squadron leader, P-38, and he disappeared over Germany like 2 weeks before the end of the war. His name's on the wall. Len Miller's name is on the wall. And as over the years they have discovered some of the bodies of some of the missing, they put a star next to the name on the wall. It's a special place. That's basically the story of Billy Fiske. He was a hero. Like I said, he's buried in one of the pictures in a minute about a short film that we took off of, I believe it's YouTube, and then Kevin Billings is the president of the foundation, and then they sent me a slideshow. Like I said, I was just asked 2 weeks ago to do this. This is the first time I've really had a chance to get up in front of people and talk about Billy Fiske and this. So I'm sorry if this talk seemed a little bit discombobulated. One of the things that I will be doing is sitting down and putting together a speech of more of his background, what happened, interesting person. And Greg, if you're still here, in case I screw this up, would you start the film for me?
Billy Fiske was no ordinary pilot. Born into a wealthy American family, he was an Olympic gold medalist, racing driver, and movie producer. At the outbreak of war, he volunteered to fly with the Royal Air Force. He saw combat during the Battle of Britain and claimed 3 enemy aircraft before he himself was shot down on August the 16th, 1940. A day later, he died from his wounds and thus became the first American airman to be killed in World War II. The Battle of Britain had only just commenced when Billy Fiske joined 601 Squadron at RAF Tangmere. 601 had originally been dubbed the Millionaire Squadron, as most of the officers were affluent young men. Although these playboys showed little regard for the discipline and routine of regular service, they were an effective fighting unit. In 1940, they found themselves right on the front line. Tangmere, on the Sussex coast, was a sector station within 11 Group Fighter Command. At the time, 4 fighter squadrons were based there, protecting important targets such as Portsmouth, Southampton, and shipping in the English Channel. As the threat of invasion grew, and the Luftwaffe ramped up its offensive against the Royal Air Force, Tangmere became a key location in the defence of southern England. By July 1940, 601 Squadron, now equipped with Hawker Hurricanes, had already seen a fair amount of combat. On the 20th, Billy Fiske flew his first operational sortie with the squadron. Although he had above-average flying skills, he'd only completed his first flight on a Hurricane 6 days earlier. Over the next 27 days, he would fly 42 operations, and as many as 4 in a single day. On the 11th of August, the squadron engaged an enemy formation of over 200 aircraft. Fiske claimed a Messerschmitt 110 and shot down. 2 days later, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Eagle Attack, a full-out assault to destroy the Royal Air Force. 601 flew 3 sorties that day, all before the afternoon. On the 3rd, they were tasked to intercept enemy fighters over Portland. The fighting was fierce, and Fiske claimed another 110, probably shot down, and 2 damaged. 2 days after that, he forced a German bomber into a balloon barrage. On the 16th of August, the squadron was scrambled to intercept a formation of Junkers 87s, the infamous Stukas that were heading for Tangmere. The Hurricanes were barely airborne before the combat broke out. At some point, Fiske's Hurricane was hit, possibly by return fire from one of the Stukas. His engine seized, but he had enough altitude to glide back to the airfield below. He made a forced landing with the undercarriage up, but the aircraft burst into flames. He was pulled, badly burned from the wreckage, and taken to hospital. 2 days later, he succumbed to his injuries. Billy Fiske was a member of 601 Squadron for little over a month. In that short time, he proved his worth as a fighter pilot. His action as an American citizen who had no obligation to fight for Britain at the time is one that will be echoed by thousands of American airmen in the years to come. His sacrifice is best summed up by a memorial dedicated to him in St. Paul's Cathedral. An American citizen who died that England might live. And joining me on the line now is historian and broadcaster Paul Beaver, and we've got from Washington, the former Assistant Secretary of the United States Air Force and the President of the Billy Fiske Foundation, Kevin Billings. Gentlemen, hello, good afternoon, and thank you for coming onto the show.
Great pleasure to be here with Aviators Lounge.
Paul, if I can come to you first. 601 Squadron, fascinated by this, formed in 1925, affluent young men, all from picked from a London club. This looks like something out of Downton Abbey. Can you give us the background about 601 and how they ended up, what they ended up doing during the war?
Yeah, 601 Squadron, of course, is nicknamed the Millionaires' War, and it's a part of the Auxiliary Air Force. In the 1920s, there was a move to form a whole series of county-based squadrons. 601 is County of London, and the aim of it was to create squadrons that were, to a certain extent, self-financing. But they were all determined that when the squadron was formed, they would be as good as the regulars, that they would be, with their flying skills, with their navigation, all of this would be as good as the regulars. And they started first as a bomber squadron, didn't really become a fighter squadron until war clouds over Europe. And then, of course, 1940, they get split into two. A flight goes to France, B flight goes to Hawkinge. They're flying Hurricanes. They get together again after the fall of France and go to be the first fighter squadron at Ariel. And from there down to Tangier, and if you like, to start them in the Battle of Britain. But the Millionaires' Mob bit disappeared, of course, with the outbreak of war, because they had other people drafted in.
Kevin, we're talking about 1940, we're talking about 18 months before America enters the war. We're talking about the Battle of Britain, and we've got an American national flying and fighting with the Royal Air Force. Where did Billy Fiske come from? What was his backstory?
Well, Billy Fiske was born in Chicago and grew up in New York, but also in London and in France. His father was an investment banker and spent time all over the world. As a youngster, he had learned to ski and ride the bobsled and toboggans and the Cresta in San Moritz. And in the 1928 Olympics, he was the captain of the U.S. bobsled team. And then in 1932, he carried the flag to the United States at the Olympic Games in Lake Placid. And then in 1936, he refused to join the games in Germany. And what he did then was he went to Aspen, Colorado, and was he and a mate were the founders of the first ski lodge in Aspen, Colorado. And his vision was to turn Aspen into what it is today. But a couple of months after the war broke out, he decided he wanted to be wanted to be with his friends. He wrote his sister and said that the Brits have been really good to me in good times, and I'm going to be with them in their bad times. And so he faked a Canadian passport and went over on the Aquitania, and then ended up in the UK, went to flying school, and then joined 601 Squadron.
From your point of view, there were hundreds of pilots who flew during the Battle of Britain. There were tens of thousands of American pilots who flew during the war. What stands out with the Billy Fiske story for you?
What strikes me is he represents everything that is good about the relationship between Great Britain and the United States. what he did was, again, it was not for money. He had all the money he needed in the world. It was to be with his mates, and that is what the Billy Fiske Foundation is really about. It's about the personal relationships between Americans and Brits in all different levels, in the military, at the school level, and whatever we can do to bring that together. And one of the first things we're doing is, we've been working with the embassy in London, is to have a statue of Billy Fiske at the embassy.
Now, arguably, he is the first American pilot to be killed during the war, isn't he? And we are literally talking, he is number one. There are thousands of American airmen who give their lives during the Second World War after him. He is number one, isn't he?
I'm rereading one of my favorite books by Lynn Olson called Citizens of London. And it talks about, there's a chapter in there that talk about the Americans who came over at the outset, and it starts with the story of Billy Fiske. But when you think of Ambassador Gil Wynant, Ed Murrow, Abraham Harriman, these folks who were there, who believed in England, believed in the UK, when you had and replaced such a defeatist as Kennedy. It was just a remarkable shift. I mean, these folks had believed in what was going on, and they were part of desperately trying to get the Americans into the war. And Fiske understood that from the very beginning. I mean, that's part of what he gained from his friendships with the Brits. It was those individual friendships and the understanding of the shared values that led him to join the RAF and come over at the outset.
Well, Kevin, thank you for talking us through, and thank you for coming onto the show.
Well, you're welcome. I look forward to it. Thank you.
A limited edition t-shirt featuring Billy Fiske's Hurricane is now available from Black Star Brands. The artwork by Philip West depicts Hurricanes of number 601 Squadron from RAF Tangmere on patrol over the Sussex coast during the Battle of Britain. The t-shirts are sold in support of the Billy Fiske Foundation. Visit Black Star Brands for more details.
If I can figure out how to turn this off. Kevin. I am, believe me, a dinosaur when it comes to some of these electronics. I've been told I've kind of gone over a little bit, but there are two things I want to do before we end, or three things. One, if y'all have any questions, I'd be more than happy to try and answer them for you. Second thing, if you're interested in Battle of Britain or Billy Fiske, there are a number of books, but three in particular, that I would recommend that you read. One was the one that Kevin mentioned called Citizens of London. The second book, which was all about 601 Squadron, is called Millionaire Squadron. And the third book by an artist, a writer, Alex Kershaw, called The Few, that was based on the Americans who flew in the RAF. And if you would like me to send you a list of books or whatever, I'll be more than happy when we're done to give you my email address or my phone number if you want, and feel free to contact me. Second thing is that if you have not been, or if you do go over to London, there are several places that I would urge you, if you have an interest in the RAF and the Battle of Britain, to go to. One, of course, is I mentioned Uxbridge, the bunker at Uxbridge. The second would be the RAF Museum in Hendon, in North London, just north of London, which is also part of the Imperial War Museum. The Imperial War Museum in London is an absolute must. The third place would be, like I said, the American Cemetery in Mattingly, is Hallett Brown. Then, of course, there's the airfield at Duxford, which is, again, run by the Imperial War Museum. I've also been to Hawkinge, where there's no longer an airfield there now, but it is a Battle of Britain museum. The airfield at Manston, where actually the runways are still in use. These are all down in Kent in southern England. And the final place that I would recommend that you go to is right near Dover. And I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of where it is because it's French, and French and I don't get along. But that is the Battle of Britain Memorial. And the building itself, where they have the museum, if you go upstairs to the second floor and you look down, it is shaped with looks like the elliptical wings of a Spitfire. And in front of the museum, the memorial, there is, off to the side, there is a listing of, again, all the pilots who perished during the Battle of Britain. But what's tremendous is where this memorial is located. It's right at the cliffs of Dover, and you're looking over to Pas-de-Calais, which is an English channel. It's the shortest distance between France and England. And there is a sculpture, very large, of a pilot sitting cross-legged, looking out over the channel. And if you want to see it, I have it in my phone. Looking for his lost mates to return. So I would urge you, if you go over, those are places that just, if you have an interest in Battle of Britain, go to those places and visit them. They're excellent. With that, I thank you for coming. If you have any questions, please, I'll do my best to try and answer them.